Let's talk a little bit about cooking meat. And this is a slide that I've shown you before. And the whole story is about water loss, really. Water squeezed out by the denaturation of proteins. So when proteins are unfolded, they tend to glom together in non-productive ways. And when they do that very tightly, they squeeze out water. The more water we squeeze out, the drier and drier the meat becomes, right? It makes intuitive sense. We lose water, we get dry. Now, let's follow the trajectory here, though. At low temperature, 120 degrees, we begin to denature muscle proteins, releasing water and aggregating those proteins. As we increase temperature, more and more coagulate. We release more water. That can be a good thing in the short run because the meat has a mouth feel that's juicy. But if we keep going higher, we release so much water that the meat begins to get tough. However, at the same time, we elevate temperature, we're beginning to degrade connective tissue, and the connective tissue is the main thing that makes the meat feel tough. And so if we cook slowly at high elevated temperature, then that connective tissue completely degrades and rearranges to become a much looser network of collagen molecules, and it makes for a much more tender product. So what should you do? It really depends on the kind of meat that you're working with and what your preferences are. Some people really prefer very rare meat, even bleu meat, which is barely seared at all on the outside and entirely raw on the inside. Others prefer to have very well done meat, in which the meat is completely cooked through, raised up to a temperature of greater than 170 degrees. But how you cook that meat really depends on what kind of meat it is, as not just your preferences. So a very tender piece of meat with only small amounts of connective tissue, a high quality piece of sirloin, for example, really requires very little cooking. It's already tender to the touch and tender to the tooth, degrades easily in the mouth. This is a piece of meat that you would only have to cook at very low temperatures, perhaps, or very relatively short periods of time. Whereas if you're cooking a roast or something that's a fairly low quality piece of meat, lots of connective tissue, tough meat, you're going to have to cook that for longer. And in fact, that's what we see done when we have a pot roast, for example, that sits in the oven at high temperature for a very long time and begins to break down over time. Now, we combat the dryness in that case with a very fatty piece of meat to begin with. So even though the proteins are aggregating and drying out, there's plenty of fat present to keep it feeling juicy. But there are times when we're still combating getting too cooked, right? Getting things cooked to the way we like it without things getting tough and stringy. And there are various ways of thinking about how to meet this challenge. How to minimize toughness and water loss while maximizing collagen breakdown. So again, water loss and toughness go hand in hand as we denature those proteins and they aggregate together. A few different possibilities that you can try. One, high temperature browning followed by low temperature completion. So that's searing the exterior and and then slowly cooking the meat through to the rest of its thickness. Um, this isn't necessarily sealing in the juices so much as it is achieving the sort of slightly burned qualities that we like on our exterior while minimizing the denaturation and aggregation of proteins on the interior, right? See the difference there. Another one is all as well. If you have a very high quality piece of meat like a filet mignon, very small amount of connective tissue, you can enhance the texture, if you will, by wrapping it in fat. You can do this with other forms of meat as well. So again, while you are going to lose water if you cook it for a long period of time, you can compensate somewhat by increasing the fat content. Another technique that's also very important for more than one reason is allowing the piece of meat to rest. So you can cook it on the grill to some internal temperature or some external temperature and then remove it and the meat will continue to cook as that heat is slowly transferred into the interior of the item. Now, beyond simply continuing to cook, resting the meat has other important benefits. As the temperature cools down after you take it off the grill, the meat fibers become um, less deformable and more likely to retain water. So that you'll notice if you immediately pull a piece of tri-tip off the grill, start slicing it immediately, you have a lot of water loss. But if you wait 5 or 10 minutes, you'll actually, even though the meat isn't any less rare, for example, you'll still see much less water lost as you slice into it. So resting is important for a couple of reasons. Something else that people face when cooking meat in terms of overcooking meat is turkey. Um, we haven't talked and we won't talk much about poultry in this meat lesson, but we will touch on it here because it's something that's so common to so many people's experiences. We take a 15 or 20 pound turkey, we put it in the oven for 4 hours, 5 hours, and we expect that the breast is nice and juicy, just as the and we expect that the legs are completely done through. This is the challenge, right? How do you cook the really deep and dense pieces of meat completely and safely so that you eliminate all bacterial contamination while not overdoing the relatively delicate and exposed pieces of meat like the breast that everybody loves? It's basically an impossible task, but there are strategies that people suggest. First, don't shield, that is, don't put a piece of foil over the turkey, and don't baste it. That actually cools the meat off as the liquid evaporates from the surface of the meat and actually slows the cooking time. That's only going to cause the meat to get drier. Second, you can rotate that turkey so that you're cooking the top and the bottom and maybe exposing the delicate breast to a little bit less heat. But third, you can just accept that dark meat with more connective tissue is going to need longer to cook than the white meat. And instead of trying to serve one big turkey, which is maybe aesthetically pleasing, but culinarily distasteful, just cut the thing up and cook them separately. And that's the most effective way to accomplish this. Now, you can also deep fry the turkey, and I have done this myself and can attest to the high quality of this kind of bird. Dropping it into a deep fryer at elevated hot oil at elevated temperature, and we'll talk about that temperature in just a moment. Immediately denatures the proteins at the exterior, and you do in fact can in fact form a shell. You don't see lots of penetration of oil into the meat itself, but that meat does more slowly heat up over without reaching those high external temperatures. So you basically are still slow cooking the interior, and so you do get a fairly tough, crispy, which is pleasant exterior, and a nice, juicy interior. So the deep fryer is really a great way to go if you insist on that aesthetic of the whole turkey sitting there ready to carve. Cooking methods, I'm just going to list these off for us so that we've thought about them. All of these methods involve applying heat to the meat. Fire, we talked about it initially. Broil, you can broil it in a in a in an oven, um, or over a fire. You can put it on a spit and rotate it, and the spit has the benefits of being able to uh, maintain an even cooking over the entire piece of meat. Barbecue is something that we use commonly in the United States. Hot coals with a piece of metal grating that we set the meat on top of. Roasting is interior to an oven. There's low temperature versus high temperature roasting that we can do depending on what our goals are. Again, in terms of degradation of that collagen connective tissue. Something that people probably most often do is just because of convenience is frying on a metal pan, or also known as sautéing, often with a small amount of oil coating the surface. Now, that's as opposed to deep frying, which is at more elevated temperatures, 300 to 350. But again, what this allows us to do is to create a coating of very hot oil around the external part of the meat, allowing the internal part to cook a little bit more slowly. We can also use water to, this is referred to variously as braising, stewing, simmering and poaching of meat. And this is an effective way to cook meat, especially if you're trying to avoid the formation of those polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that we talked about as carcinogens at the beginning of this talk. Steam is also a very effective way to cook meat, and that's just because as the water condenses from steam onto the surface of the meat, it gives up its heat very efficiently. So the water cools down, the meat heats up incredibly fast. This is why you can get such a terrible burn from steam. I'm sure many of you are familiar with as well. So we have to be careful using this method, but also realize that it can be very effective at heating something up quickly. And again, the method that we want to use when we're, especially for these first couple of techniques of cooking meat, is allowing that meat to rest. But it's still an important thing to recall in any of these techniques is giving the meat a few minutes to rest. Improves the texture, minimizes water loss, and if you're losing the water as you cut the piece of meat up, you're also losing some juiciness as well that you could just as well be encountering in your mouth.